Prospect Publishing is proud to present Colossus, Quest for the Giant Heart of Gold. A story by Teddy D. Read by the author. Dedicated to my father, who taught me the best way to deal with a bully was to try to remember that that bully acts the way they do because of a need that they have. Try to find that need and fill it, and you might have a new friend if you can find that inner heart of gold and treat them the way you would want to be treated. If that fails, punch them in the nose. And now, Colossus, The Quest for the Giant Heart of Gold by Teddy D. In a land not far from here, in a time long forgotten, there was a kingdom that stretched from the mountains to the sea. It was a miserable place to be. The people who lived in the towns and villages of this kingdom had been strapped with a heavy burden that each man, woman, and child were forced to carry. The weight each person in the kingdom lived with caused everyone to shuffle along at a snail's pace. No one smiled or greeted one another on account of the fact that they were unable to lift their heads to look up. Instead, their eyes were forever cast downwards, never able to witness another sunset or gaze up into the brilliance that was the star-studded night. The heavy burden chained to the people of this kingdom was not a figure of speech. Instead, the weight on each back in the kingdom was in the form of an actual physical rock of enormous size. These boulders had been strapped to every soul by a giant who had moved quickly through the kingdom, snatching person after person and fixing an appropriate sized rock upon his or her back. They knew the giant was acting on orders of the evil king who had come to rule over their land. But the kingdom had not always been such a miserable place. In fact, it had been a kingdom of peace and happiness for a very long time before the rocks became a permanent fixture on each person living there. It was in this kingdom that the forces of good and evil had fought an epic battle. For generations, the war lingered on, until evil was finally vanquished and the forces of truth and love stood victorious. It is said the celebration lasted for an entire year, as the people cheered the fact that evil had been conquered. They believed evil would never be heard from again. But evil had not vanished from the face of the earth. Instead, it had slithered into the shadows and lay quietly, patient. From the depths it watched, and in the darkness it waited, for the world to forget it ever existed at all. And when the forces of good would grow lazy and soft, as they always did in times of peace, evil would spring forth from the dark and conquer all. Generations passed without war or hardship, and the people who lived in the many villages and towns scattered about this vast kingdom were peaceful and friendly. The kings that ruled over the land for those generations had been kind and fair. Except for the occasional trouble caused by a sorceress casting spells or a giant stealing gold from travelers on the road, the kingdom enjoyed a long period of peace and prosperity. However, the people were blissfully unaware that the period of peace they grew so accustomed to was soon to come to an end. Evil, like a snake, licked the air and could smell that the time had come to return to the kingdom. The king and queen had 4 sons in line for the throne. Each young prince was a shining example of goodness, except for the youngest prince, who was very different indeed. As a baby, they would find snakes sleeping with him in his crib, yet he would never be bitten. As a young boy grew older, while his older brothers were learning the ways of charity, proper manners, and the rules of law, the youngest prince occupied himself by pulling cruel pranks on castle servants and teasing the royal pets. At a very early age, it had been obvious to those around him that this young prince had been born with a heart of darkness, and it was pure evil that pumped through his veins. And because evil is ugly, the outside appearance of one who practices in the art of evil is gradually changed to reflect the ugly evil that lives within. The servants had a nickname for the Dark Prince that they whispered only to each other when alone: the Snake Prince. The Snake Prince watched how the people clapped and cheered when his father, the king, traveled through their villages. They loved and respected his father, and would throw rose petals at his three brothers. As time rolled onward, the Snake Prince began to notice how the people looked at him differently than they did his father or brothers. The beaming smiles on the faces of the king's subjects vanished when their eyes traveled from his older brothers to him. No one in the kingdom recognized evil, since they had never seen it before. But they knew there was something dreadfully wrong with the youngest prince. Concern never existed regarding the youngest prince becoming king, because his older brothers were first in line for the throne. This meant the Snake Prince would never be able to exercise any true power over the kingdom. But when the three older brothers and their father never returned from an ocean fishing trip, concern spread like a wildfire through the kingdom. Hearts grew heavy with worry, and this could be seen on the faces of every citizen of the land. Search and rescue boats attempted to locate the royal fishing boat and those on board without success. The rescuers reported upon their return that the sea was teeming with snakes. So many, in fact, they could not see the water through the slithering mass of reptiles. A cold wind swept across the kingdom that day, and though no one could put their finger on it, all knew the chilling wind that whipped through their hearts carried with it a promise of change. None imagined the heavy weight that change would soon bring upon them. The reason for the disappearance of the boat and the royal passengers was never discovered, but most everyone in the kingdom knew deep down the evil prince had something to do with it. In one horrible, mysterious accident, the Snake Prince was to be crowned the Snake King. The Snake King's first royal decree was to have his servants dig a pit in the castle courtyard, and then filled with as many snakes as it could hold. The second action was to have a certain sorceress kidnapped and brought before him. She was said to have the power to see into the future, and the evil king had great use for such a power. As he had ordered, the witch was delivered to him. She kicked and screamed within the black bag that had been used to catch her. Once untied, there was a long pause as the bag grew still and silent, just before a bright flash and cloud of smoke startled all in the chamber. The witch exploded from the bag and flew upwards, where she stopped and hovered over the soldiers that surrounded her. All those in the king's chambers gasped at the sight of her grotesque features and green, slimy skin.
"Why have you abducted me? Your soldiers ambushed me in the middle of the night. In a black bag they carried me here. I demand to know why."
The anger that boiled within the sorceress grew so intense her green skin began to turn blood red. Seated in his throne, the Snake King smiled a devilish grin and displayed his yellow cracked teeth through lips of scales. To gaze upon him was to look into your deepest fears. To listen to his voice was to relive the nightmares of your youth. Even the sorceress, who herself had been transformed by the ugliness of evil doings, found it difficult to look at the king for too long.
"Demand? You are in no position to demand anything, witch,"
the Snake King thundered, holding a necklace with a large dark jewel up for the sorceress to see.
"Not as long as I have this. My amulet!"
She swooped down over the soldiers and landed in front of the throne.
"That is mine," she hissed. "I am powerless without it."
The sorceress reached out with both hands, but the king just knocked her away. "You still have the power to cast those spells that are spoken by the tongue," the king sneered from his throne. "Or shall I take that power from you too?" Her eyes darted back and forth from the king to the amulet he held in his hand.
What do you want from me?
The king licked his lips with a forked tongue and said, "To see the future, of course."
And if I show you the future, you will let me go back to my dwelling in the woods with my amulet?
The sorceress asked. "In time, but your services have been requested by your king. Are you not willing to assist your king?" He narrowed his eyes and leaned forward in his throne. The sorceress knew better than to deny the evil king. She had no wish to lose her tongue that night, so she agreed to use her magic to serve the king. Reciting an ancient spell, the sorceress mixed a thick jelly-like liquid that bubbled and burped. The red goop in the cauldron served as her eye to see into the future. When it was ready, she peered into the thick soup that swirled within the cauldron and told the king what she saw.
You will rule this land as the most powerful, most feared king this kingdom has ever known for many years.
The king rubbed his hands together, the evil grin on his lips growing wider as he listened. "Yes, go on, witch. What else? I want to hear it all." The sorceress peered further into the eye.
But you will meet your end by the hand of a giant, and the people will rejoice when you are cast out of the kingdom.
"Liar!" The evil king squeezed his fist until the glass he held shattered. "Why do you tell me these lies, witch?"
I speak of only what the eye shows me, my lord.
The sorceress bowed her head and stepped back from the cauldron. "But what you see is the future that I have yet to alter," the king said to himself. "I cannot be overthrown by a giant if there are no more giants left." The sorceress watched the Snake King pace back and forth, rubbing his hands together as he worked on a most sinister plan in his most evil mind. She understood at that moment that as long as the king wished to know what the future held for him, she would be a prisoner in that castle. He would use her ability to stay ahead of all his enemies and potential threats by crushing them before they even decided to take action against him. This would allow him to keep a stranglehold on the kingdom for all of his days, unless she did something about it. So as he paced the floor hatching a diabolical scheme, she silently began doing the same. He was not the only one in the room with a few tricks up the sleeve.